The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Lunch and Learn Conversations on Bias. Before we get started, I'd like to run over a few housekeeping items so you all know how to participate in today's event. First, all lines are on mute. If you experience any technical difficulties at any point during our presentation, please explain your problem through the chat feature, and we will try our best to address the issue. Lastly, we're recording this session, and the video will be available on our YouTube page within 24 hours. Please subscribe to New Jersey OAG on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Flickr for the latest updates on information, resources, and news from our office. Now I'd like to welcome New Jersey Attorney General Kabir Grewal.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our virtual town hall lunch and learn conversations on bias. This is part of our 2121 project, which stands for 21 Counties 21st Century Policing. We started this in 2018 as a way to bring law enforcement and the communities we serve together. We've had hundreds of in-person meetings over the last 2 years, but unfortunately this year, COVID disrupted our plans. But rather than let COVID completely stop these 2121s, we pivoted to a virtual platform. And so while we might be physically disconnected, we're more socially connected. And now today we'll talk about bias crimes and the current state of bias offenses in New Jersey with two esteemed panelists. We have Jonathan Greenblatt, who's the Chief Executive Officer and National Director of the Anti-Defamation League. And we're also joined by Dave D'Amico, who's the head of the New Jersey Bias Crimes Officers Association. We'll talk about local strategies. But to kick off our program, we have a message from Governor Murphy, which we'll turn to right now. Whitney? Thank you, Governor, for those opening remarks. Now I'd like to move to our first conversation with Jonathan Greenblatt. We're going to be talking about the ADL's anti-Semitism audit. We're going to be talking about trends and numbers, and sometimes these numbers can be discouraging. But when I look at these numbers, I also see opportunity. And I think about the words of Nelson Mandela, who famously in his Long Walk to Freedom wrote that no one is born hating another person because of the color of their skin, their religion, or their background, that people must learn to hate. And if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love, because love comes much more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. So with that, let's turn to Jonathan Greenblatt. Jonathan, if you don't mind, can you give an introduction to our audience about the ADL and the work that the ADL does?
Sure. First of all, let me thank you, Mr. Attorney General, for having me here today. I also want to thank Governor Murphy for his opening remarks. And I just think this is a really important conversation. So I'm particularly pleased that you're hosting it and grateful for the opportunity to share ADL's perspective. Just to up-level all your audience, ADL is the oldest anti-hate organization in the world, one of the longest-standing civil rights groups in the country. For more than 100 years, we've been focused on fighting anti-Semitism, racism, and all forms of bigotry. And indeed, we're living in a moment like no other. And we know that not just by anecdote in some abstract way, that's what the data tells us. Since 1979, we've been doing audits of anti-Semitic incidents. Through our network of 25 offices across the country, we collect data on bias incidents that affect the Jewish community. These could be examples of harassment, vandalism, or violence. And in 2019, we recorded literally the highest number of incidents we've ever seen in 40 years of doing this work. Overall, across the country, the number was up 12%. Increases we saw in vandalism, which went up, or harassment, which went up 6%. Vandalism, which increased 19%. And assaults surged literally a whopping 56% from the prior year. And of course, 2019 was punctuated by some of those violent anti-Semitic acts in memory, including the daily litany of assaults in Brooklyn, not too far from New Jersey, the shooting in San Diego in a suburb called Poway, killed several people, the stabbing in Muncie, New York, where a rabbi was murdered in his home, and of course, the supermarket in Jersey City. And that was a particularly heinous event where 3 people were killed and another person was injured. So we've seen this across the country, but maybe we could talk over for just a moment about what's happened in New Jersey, because the numbers there, I think, are also quite surprising and, again, larger than we've seen in the past. So in New Jersey alone, we saw the highest number of incidents that we've ever recorded for the Garden State. 345 versus 200 the year before. That's a 73% increase year over year. That included 179 incidents of vandalism, up 72%, 161 incidents of harassment, up 71%, and 5 incidents of assault, 150% increase. And so to put this in some perspective, the shooting in Jersey City, that's just one incident, okay? Even though 3 people were killed, but that's one incident. And that was just really disturbing. And I'll also just say, we're troubled by wherever this happens, but in particular in educational environments. I mean, ADL is very focused on anti-bias education. Our children go to school to learn. Our children go to school to be supported. And what's really alarming is seeing the increase of harassment and bullying there. And indeed, we saw 97, almost 100 acts of anti-Semitism at schools, K-12 schools across New Jersey. That was more than a 50% increase over the prior year. And that increase was almost triple what we saw across the country. And so just to give you some perspective, New Jersey was the state where we saw the second most number of overall incidents, just behind New York. Now, again, we saw more incidents in New Jersey than the state of California, which has more than 4.5 times your population. So anyone who tells you that these numbers are exaggerated is wrong. Anyone who tells you this is purely a political phenomenon is also wrong. I mean, the shooters in Jersey City, they weren't wearing MAGA hats. The fact of the matter is we see anti-Semitism and other forms of racism. It's not the domain of any one particular political group. Prejudice happens on all sides of the spectrum, And that's why we need to call it out whenever and wherever it happens.
There's a lot there to unpack, and the work that the ADL does is so instrumental in helping us understand this issue, and the data really, I think, underscores how severe the problem is. The ADL also works on solutions. So before I get into my question, I want to thank you for the work that the ADL did with our office on the Youth Bias Task Force report, which has been delayed because of COVID, but is forthcoming. So unpacking these numbers, these trends have continued up and up and up and up over the last number of years, and it's alarming. How did we get here? And how did New Jersey get here? You know, what are some of the root causes that you have seen for this type of escalation in the number of anti-Semitic incidents across the country, and in particular New Jersey?
So I think there are a few factors that are at play, and we're sort of seeing a bit of a perfect storm. So I think number one, I think the charged political environment. I mean, people are on edge, and let's just be frank, prejudice has now become part of the political conversation. Officials at the highest levels feel free to demagogue, feel free to slander, feel free to harass in ways we've never seen before. And we need our leaders to lead. And when they delve into stereotypes and scapegoating, that creates an environment in which we shouldn't be surprised where bigotry can really fester and spread. So number one, we've got a charged political environment and prejudice right in the middle of it. Number two, extremists are exploiting this moment. I mean, we've seen extremists in New Jersey, across the country, try to move into the mainstream and take advantage of this, again, polarized atmosphere in ways that are really ugly. Number three, social media has really reinforced some of the worst tendencies to become a breeding ground for bigotry. So I think social media and big companies' failure to fully address this issue once and for all has allowed, it's amplified and exacerbated the worst voices. And so I think that's got a lot to do with it too.
You know, I think that there's two threads that I pull from what you've said. One, that there's been a normalization almost of this conduct because of the dialogue of leaders, those with platforms. And two, a normalization caused by social media. When folks are seeing this in their streams and they're seeing things online, it almost becomes legitimized in a way. And then there's the opportunists who are taking advantage of this. What is the ADL doing to push back in these areas, and what can we do, and what can viewers do to push back as well? And when I say we, those of us in government.
I think they're great point, and I'll just say something. One of the reasons why this issue is of such concern, I would say, anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem, if you will. Anti-Semitism is typically the canary in the coal mine. It's typically a harbinger of hate. And we see many examples of when you normalize anti-Semitism, okay? Again, wherever it comes from, when it becomes mainstreamed, it lays the groundwork for other kinds of bigotry, again, to spread. And we've seen this. We've seen the kind of anti-Black racism which has sprung out after the death of George Floyd. We've seen anti-Asian racism catalyzed by COVID-19. And again, when the population becomes more and more numb to bigotry, more of it spreads, and we shouldn't be surprised. That's why this is so frightening. So what can we do? Well, I think there are a few things. Number one, I think, again, we need our leaders to lead. It's the governor of the state of New Jersey, it's the president of the local school board, to say when they hear something, to say something and to call it down, no matter if it's the other side or maybe more important, what's on their own side. Say prejudice has no place in a political conversation. You know, bigotry does not belong in a public debate, and they're not going to tolerate it. I think that's number one. I think number two, it's really crucial to really try to hold the places where this is happening accountable. So again, social media. We need not just our elected officials and political leaders to lead, but I'm happy that's happening through the Stop Hate for Profit campaign, which we can talk about if you want, where businesses are finally holding Facebook accountable the way they haven't before. Then number three, I think, pardon?
No, go ahead, please.
And then I think number three, I think we all have the capacity for change. I think it starts by, again, calling out and interrupting intolerance when we hear it. whether that's like a Zoom meeting like this, or at the water cooler, or in the locker room, or over the family dinner table. And, you know, ADL, we're very focused on solving the problems, which is one of the reasons why we do anti-bias education. So we have some of the best content in the United States, curricular materials, extracurricular, and I think schools should be places where our kids are supported, where they're taught and reinforced values that hopefully start at home. And so if you see something happening in a school or in a local environment, you know, bring in ADL or bring in another nonprofit to help educate your kids and create a better, more supportive environment, academic environment.
You mentioned the Stop the Hate campaign, and I want to talk about the role that social media has played and how you're holding social media accountable. So if you could share in broad strokes, that campaign actually started today on July 1st, and can you just share with the audience what that campaign entails?
Sure. So the ADL, we're focused on fighting hate, and we believe Facebook is the front line in that fight. You know, ADL, we monitor hate both offline but also online. And our latest report of online hate and harassment, we found that 42% of users reported some degree of harassment, 28% experiencing severe harassment. Then we drilled down to, well, where's that happening? The platform where it's happening more frequently than any other is Facebook. Nearly 80% of their users who've been harassed, it's happened to them on the Facebook platform. So that's deeply problematic. So we created a civil rights coalition, the NAACP, Color of Change, Common Sense Media, LULAC, the National Hispanic Media Group, and a bunch of Media Center and a bunch of other great organizations, created Stop Hate for Profit, asking advertisers to take a 30-day pause in their ad spend on Facebook for the month of July. So it's not a permanent boycott. It's not a long-term walkout. It's a 30-day pause to push the company to finally take steps to deal with the hate on their platform. And I'm talking about concrete measures that wouldn't, you know, that wouldn't bankrupt the company, that wouldn't upend the business model, that would simply make it safer and more secure for its users. That would help those people who are harassed on the platform get the support they need. That would make sure there's a civil rights infrastructure in Facebook to keep the company accountable internally, and there's transparency and regular audits of how they're doing to deal with hate. So long story short, 2 weeks ago, we started the campaign and we announced it. We didn't have a single business lined up. It started today, and I can tell you the response has been overwhelming. We've had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of small businesses who've joined. We've had iconic American brands, Hershey's, Levi's, Ford, Kind Bars, Starbucks, Coca-Cola, White Castle, Target, Best Buy, Pfizer, Patagonia, Ben & Jerry's. This is just off the top of my head. And in addition, we've had a lot of big global companies, Diageo, Lego, Unilever, VW, Acura, Honda, and others. I mean, and I think the reason why we've had this universal response is that brands realize it's a universal problem, and they don't want their ads to subsidize hate. So I'm hoping we'll get this stopped in the near term, sit down with Facebook and work out a plan, because ultimately they may be part of the problem, but they need to be part of the solution, and we want to make that happen.
Yeah, you know, we've seen this in our own experience in New Jersey, how Facebook has given quarter to those with bigoted and anti-Semitic beliefs and on Facebook. And we've worked hard with the ADL and others to shut down some of these pages where the rhetoric is so vile, and it's included in your report about Rise Up Ocean County and other groups that are really capitalizing on anti-Semitic ideologies and tropes and pushing them out. And the fear, of course, from someone in my position is, well, those words lead to conduct. And so they lead to the bias offenses. They lead to the numbers we're seeing in our schools. They lead to people acting out. They lead to the assaults. So we have to nip it in the bud. So I couldn't be happier that you're doing this and pushing for accountability from Facebook, which has not stepped up to date. And it's my hope that they abide by some of the recommendations and audits that you're encouraging them to implement. Circling back to the numbers, Jonathan, why does New Jersey stand out? Why does New Jersey have this problem, in your view? And and why in the schools? Why are we seeing it now increase on campuses? Because that's one of the more alarming trends that I've also noticed. And you talked about the educational tools that the ADL provides. What are some strategies that an attorney general or others in other state governments where there might not be as drastic as the numbers as you see in New Jersey? What are some of the strategies we can employ to deal with it at the younger level?
Okay, so there are a few things. I mean, why is that in New Jersey? I do want to make the point, this is not a localized problem. This is a national crisis.
Yep.
So it's not so much that it's particular to New Jersey, but rather that New Jersey reflects these broader trends. We certainly do see there tends to be more anti-Semitism in places where you have a larger Jewish presence. It's a little counterintuitive. You might think that more Jewish people around you would actually depress prejudiced attitudes, but in fact, it's troublesome that the bigots thrive on this. So I think that is part of the problem. I think you're also on the edges of New York City, which is the municipality with the largest Jewish population on the planet. So I think it also has something to do with it. I also think economic anxiety can feed these flames. And we know, the economic numbers, the employment numbers are difficult across the country. I think it's not unique to New Jersey, all over. And the reality is that when people feel like the government isn't helping them or the markets aren't helping them and they're not doing well, they look for someone to blame. And the Jews have been the focus of bigots in this regard for centuries. So that isn't anything new. So how do we solve it? So I think there are a few things to think about. Number one, anti-bias education is critical. And bringing, whether it's, again, ADL content or other great groups that also do this, not just ADL, that can help to inoculate our children from the virus of intolerance. And I think, number one, again, vaccinating our kids from anti-Semitism and hate is a healthy thing to do. That's number one. Number two, I think we've also got to focus on the extremists, right? So I care about casual anti-Semitism. I care about day-to-day bigotry, but I worry a great deal about the violent extremists. I've talked to U.S. Attorney Craig Carpintero about this, the number of white supremacists in the Garden State, and then we've talked about it before. This is also deeply problematic. So prioritizing a focus on the worst, most violent elements is also really important. And then number three, I would just say, another way to solve and address this is continuing to partner with civil society organizations, whether it's groups like the NAACP or the National Urban League or others that are working on anti-Black racism and dealing with, again, the systemic racism, which is so prevalent in so many of our institutions and across society today. Number two, again, dealing with other civil society groups. There's ADL, there's other great groups that can help you work on issues of anti-Semitism. Groups that also in the Asian community, whether it's, the Sikh Coalition, which works on those issues, or groups like the Asian Americans Advancing Justice. Civil society organizations can be critical partners for law enforcement and government to create sort of cohesive strategies to try to tackle this once and for all.
Those are all fantastic suggestions, and to sort of tease the upcoming Youth Bias Task Force report are part of the roadmap. Some of those suggestions that you've offered as to the path forward to deal with this problem, which we are people. So I'm hopeful with those strategies. When we see these reports in the future, we'll see the numbers trending in a downward direction because we took it seriously in this state and we partnered with organizations like yours to address it head on. You mentioned a couple. I want to talk about the current COVID-19 pandemic and what we're seeing and what you're seeing when it comes to bias defenses brought on by this pandemic. And I'll hear from you first, and I could just share with you some thoughts I had.
Sure. I mean, so there are a few things I would say. So number one, we've certainly seen a rise and a spread of anti-Semitic related sort of scapegoating around COVID-19, where Jews are being blamed for starting the virus, or uniquely spreading the virus, or somehow trying to profit off the virus. It's very familiar with the age-old anti-Semitic trope of the blood libel. I mean, Jews were blamed in Europe for the Black Plague in the medieval times. Jews have been blamed for other kind of global phenomenon. So this feels somewhat familiar. In addition, we've seen a wave of really ugly hate and harassment being directed at Asian Americans, particularly people who are perceived to be Chinese or Chinese Americans. And look, when the president calls this, when I'm not even going to dignify what he said by repeating it here, but when he uses derogatory terms to describe COVID-19, when people around him like somehow try to legitimize that, we shouldn't be surprised that other people repeat it. It creates an environment where Asian Americans are dehumanized and then get harassed. And we've seen examples at ADL, and we're tracking this every day of Asian American people being harassed on the street, stores being vandalized, people being assaulted. And a number of Asian American civil society groups are reporting very actively on this too. It's incredibly problematic. So one trend is blaming ethnic groups for this. Re-election campaign in 2020 during the presidential, I don't think it's going to get any better. So I'm worried about that. The second thing we've seen is we've watched the extremists innovate in their new methods of spreading intolerance. So we dealt with a wave of Zoom bombings earlier this year as Zoom became the prevalent or the social media platform du jour. And the product, which wasn't, it was designed for enterprises, right? It wasn't designed for people's home use. It had 20 million users at the beginning of the year. Now it has 300 million. And so what's happened is extremists discovered that and found the loopholes and then broke into and hacked into meetings to spread anti-Semitism, racism, really ugly stuff. So we've worked at ADL, we worked directly with Zoom to push them to then implement a series of improvements to the product to better protect their users. But watching intolerance innovate has reminded me that the good guys, we got to be on top of our game to not allow this to take root. And just because we're all quarantining, working from home, doesn't mean we get a day of rest from this problem.
You know, we've seen those same trends here in New Jersey about the rise in bias crimes against Asian Americans. And if there was ever a perfect example of what it means to be responsible, it would be this moment, because the rhetoric that you referred to, which I won't repeat either, from the highest levels of government, is what those who are attacking individuals in my state are repeating. It is the graffiti that they're putting in front of the Chinese restaurant, the words of the president. And if there was ever a need to be responsible or an example why, when that same rhetoric appears in bias crimes and bias incidents, it is now. We need to be seeing in this moment with respect to COVID-19. And I think you touched on it a bit earlier, and I'd ask you to comment on, is that organizations like the New Jersey European Heritage Association or NJ Europa, they are taking advantage of anti-government protests, to open up businesses and where people are cloaked in the flag and talking about fundamental rights. We are seeing them show up at these protests and take advantage of this moment to maybe recruit additional members to their organization. Is that a trend you're seeing across the country as well?
Yeah, I mean, so a couple thoughts. One thing I want to say to build upon what you said, let's make one thing clear. This is not a partisan issue. There is nothing political on pushing back on prejudice. Remember what President George W. Bush did after 9/11.
Went to a mosque.
Yeah, he went to a mosque. Make a point, this isn't a war against Islam. This isn't a conflict with American Muslims or Muslims in general. This is about dealing with a specific terrorist group. And I only wish that elected officials today would do the same thing. We're not seeing that. Now, to your point, yeah, I mean, we're really troubled at how this has expanded and grown. And it's just so critical that we speak out about it. I would say that despite some of the ugliness, and in New Jersey, again, the Ocean County thing you mentioned before has really been a hot spot. To see Orthodox Jews scapegoated this way, targeted this way, it is ugly and it is awful. And I think we just need to make sure that elected officials on both sides give this the attention that it deserves. Now, some are doing that, like there are members of Congress like Ted Lieu and Judy Chu, who called out the discrimination against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. That's really important. And we just endorsed a letter this week from Congress about that. But we've got to really look at this stuff hard. And we've got to really be willing to roll up our sleeves and realize that just because we are an Asian American doesn't mean anti-Asian racism isn't our problem too. And just because we aren't Jewish doesn't mean that anti-Semitism isn't our problem too. I mean, I have been really pleased with the fact that honestly, you and your office have really prioritized this. It's really important to send a signal. I mean, your choice in announcing the OPRA request in Ocean County, I think that is very important. And we should talk more about that because I think it augurs very well for demonstrating how your office in the state of New Jersey are taking this on with the seriousness it deserves. You guys have been very, I'd say, transparent about the extremist threat in New Jersey, which is critical. And I look forward to finding ways to continue to build upon your leadership and support you as you investigate and really prosecute hate crimes.
Well, we appreciate the partnership for sure, and we're coming to the end of our time together. And before we move on to Dave, I just want to give you an opportunity, Jonathan, to share any final thoughts. I mean, about paths forward. You mentioned a lot of things already, so you know, anything else that's on your mind, I want to give you an opportunity to share.
Well, I'll just say two things. Number one, to your earlier point, we can't allow extremist groups to be mainstreamed in this moment. And we've all got to be sort of literate consumers of political rhetoric, right? And so realize when Identity Europa, these other groups say they're only about immigration, we've got to be able to push down and look a little deeper. And if you peel back the onion just a bit and you realize that there's intolerance at the core, there should be no place for prejudice in our political conversation. And then number two, I just want to say to all the people out there who are watching, again, you don't need to be Jewish, you don't need to be Asian American, you don't need to be a Black American to be a good ally. Being a good ally starts with, again, being literate and getting educated about these issues, and then supporting, groups that are targeted and victimized. And we all have the power to use our privilege, whether it's white privilege or a kind of Christian privilege or whatever it would be, to use our privilege to help those, in need. And I think all of us have the opportunity to be good allies, to dig a little deeper, and to stand up for what's right.
Well, thank you so much, Jonathan, for your thoughts, for the incredible work that you're doing, and for the incredible partnership. And I am confident that given the hard work we're putting in now, those numbers are going to start to trend down. And that's a priority for us here at the Attorney General's office. And we look forward to implementing some of these solutions in this state. So thanks again, and stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you for your leadership.
Thank you. So let's turn to our next guest, Dave D'Amico. And Dave, before we transition to our topic, I think it's something Jonathan said occurred to me, that words matter, that it's important for us to be responsible. This isn't partisan. We saw, as Jonathan alluded to, in the wake of 9/11, as bias crimes and biased incidents in the country were on the rise against people who were Muslim American or perceived to be Muslim, or people who look different like me. President Bush went and visited a mosque in Washington, D.C. and talked about the need to respect all religions, to respect Islam, to respect differences. And what happened? The number started trending downward. Similarly, after San Bernardino, then candidate Trump talked about a travel ban. What happened? Bias offenses started going up. That's proof that words matter, that we have to be more responsible in this moment. And the moment in which we find ourselves now with COVID-19, as Jonathan talked about, has given rise to bias offenses against Asian Americans, and has given rise to anti-Semitic incidents in the wake of the current crises that we face as a state and as a country. And critical in our response at a state level to dealing with bias offenses are our bias crime officers. We have Dave D'Amico with us, who's the head of the New Jersey Bias Crime Officers Association. Dave, I would just ask you to introduce yourself to our viewers, to give a little bit about your background and about the association's mission and membership.
Thank you, General. First of all, I'd like to thank your office, and you in particular, for inviting me and the New Jersey Bias Crime Officers Association to participate in our 21-21 Lunch and Learn conversation this afternoon. I think this afternoon's Lunch and Learn conversation and virtual community outreach is extremely important, especially now, as we see not only in New Jersey, but across the country, a rise of bias-based incidents and hate. As we work together to navigate through this very difficult time, I'd like to acknowledge what your office has done, being in the forefront of partnering with the New Jersey Bias Crime Officers Association, our community stakeholders, and working together to make a difference. I'd also like to take this opportunity once again to congratulate you being the recipient of our most prestigious recognition, the Thomas Culp Senior Visionary Leadership Award. The New Jersey Bias Crime Officer Association is made up of law enforcement professionals from every level of law enforcement. We have federal, state, county, and local law enforcement professionals. And under your direction, every one of our 21 county prosecutors' offices has a dedicated bias crime and community outreach liaison. Our mission is to ensure trust and to promote a positive working relationship, not only between law enforcement, but and the community in which we serve. Our bias crime liaisons are trained to identify bias motivated incidents, investigate and prosecute the crime of bias intimidation here in New Jersey, and to be a direct point of contact at any time for anything. We've developed and implemented numerous law enforcement training seminars. We've partnered with your office and other community stakeholders to develop and implement community outreach programs. And in the state, we've also provided educational outreach to middle schools, high schools, colleges, and universities. As Jonathan said previously, our most vulnerable are our young adults, because as we know, hate is not given to us in our genes. It is a learned behavior. And even as we navigate through what I consider to be our new normal and a state of emergency with COVID-19, we have partnered with your office to provide community outreach to some of our most vulnerable victims. We partner with your office and federal partners such as the U.S. Community Relations Service and our community stakeholders to provide community outreach and build trust. We started post-COVID-19 with the Morris County Prosecutor's Office on a bias awareness seminar with 2121. We specifically reached out to our Jewish community, working with the ADL and other religious organizations. We specifically reached out to our Asian community most recently, just last week. We provided training to the Middlesex County Sheriff's Office, Monmouth County Sheriff's Office, and we're scheduled to hold both law enforcement and community-based training in numerous other jurisdictions moving forward. I believe through your office, we're also doing our Police Chaplains Conference coming up very shortly. So the message really, General, is hate is a learned value. And as you said, and as Jonathan said, and as the Governor Murphy so eloquently said in our opening remarks, if it's learned, we can unlearn it. And the New Jersey Bias Crime Officer Association is instrumental in doing everything we can to educate not only the community, but to also educate our law enforcement professionals on what to do once they recognize bias.
Well, thank you for that incredibly thorough overview of the significant and important work that your association is doing in partnership with our office and other law enforcement stakeholders. You know, one of the things that we have seen, and you alluded to, is the attacks on the Asian American community and the outreach that has been done. You know, the challenges, of course, are that we are all socially distanced. And what we tried to do was come up with informational materials in different Asian languages to push out. In ordinary times, we would have in-person meetings. We would go to vulnerable communities. We would go to schools and faith-based organizations. But given our current circumstances, not only is COVID-19 giving rise to these types of incidents, it's also preventing us from responding as we would informationally. Certainly, if there's a criminal act, we're responding and investigating. How have you worked on outreach to try to overcome the challenges of the current environment? Are you reaching out to stakeholders? Are you making phone calls? You mentioned some of the virtual sessions, but you know, there are still organizations I imagine we can't reach virtually, or communities we can't touch virtually.
We're doing everything we can, General, to try to reach out to these communities to get them to trust us. Listen, right now, trust is a big issue when it comes with law enforcement. And we know that victims of bias, if they don't trust the police, they're not going to reach out to the police. So what we've done through the Bias Officer Association is recognize that one of the things we have to do is do this community outreach virtually. And one of the things we recognize is partnering with our stakeholder organizations like the ADL, Garden State Equality, other organizations throughout the state, the Asian community, and specifically in northern New Jersey, and reaching out to also our law enforcement partners. Because like I said to you, every one of our 21 county prosecutors under your direction has a bias crime and a community outreach liaison. So using those resources to reach out to the community, we're trying our best. It is very difficult post the state of emergency and our COVID-19 pandemic. And as we see now, potentially maybe the numbers rising, that also leads to fear of individuals coming forward and reporting these incidents and having contact with law enforcement. So we got to continue doing what we're doing with our community outreach efforts. And more importantly, I think, General, you know, under your direction, New Jersey is the best trained state when it comes to law enforcement in recognizing, responding, and reporting bias incidents. At the police academy level, all of our recruits through the Police Training Commission are trained in how to recognize, respond, and report bias incidents. I continue to say, and I think it's so important through a campaign to, if you see something, say something. Now, I know that we stole that slogan from post 911 when it comes to terrorism, but it's the truth. You know, we have to confront this problem right at its base, right at when it happens. I've been challenged many times from colleagues, and when I do seminars and I talk to the public, Dave, what do you think? You're going to change the world? You're going to eradicate hate by talking to people? No. Listen, I don't like to fail. I'm a type A personality. It's not about changing the world. I don't think by doing what we're doing so well in New Jersey that we're going to eradicate hate. But what I think it's important to do is change our world, right? If we see something happen in front of us, we have to do something about it. And the one thing I think is so important, it's so important. If you see something, you got to say something. So we not only teach our law enforcement professionals, not only at the police academy level to recognize, respond, and report to bias, but we also teach our community to do the same thing. If you see something, say something. Rebuilding that trust between law enforcement and community is so important, especially to our most vulnerable victims. When you think about our victims of bias, when you think about why they were selected, you think about they were selected because of things that they can't change or shouldn't have to change. Their race, their color, their religion, their ethnic background, their sexual orientation, real or perceived, their gender or gender identity or expression, their national origin or ethnicity. So these victims walk out the door and they don't know when they're going to be targeted. There's a big target on their back, and they never know when somebody's going to choose to use the ignorance that they've been taught to target those victims. So we must continue to be aggressive. And like I said, under your office, and I have to say this, and I'm not trying to blow smoke here, but what I am trying to say is, in my 31 years experience in law enforcement, there has been no Attorney General's office that has done more than you have. And it started when you were in Bergen as the prosecutor. But when you came over and you became the Chief Law Enforcement Executive of New Jersey, you made it very clear that we have to protect our most vulnerable victims. You made it very clear that we have to increase community outreach, increase building trust between the most vulnerable communities and our law enforcement team, that we have to work together to make a difference, that we can't do this alone. So really, under your direction, we have come very far. Recently, and I think it's important to let the audience know, that recently in 2019, you updated the standards. And those standards include a direction, not only from the initial responding police officer on the scene, but all the way up to the executive, the police chief. And then also you updated our reporting system. So now we're potentially looking at possibly acts of bias or bias crimes having a nexus to terrorism. And you've opened that opportunity for all law enforcement agencies in the state to work together so that we're not ethnocentric. So there's a lot of things that we're doing. Now, of course, we can always do things better, but there's a lot of things that we're doing that in New Jersey, a lot of other states aren't doing. And I'm very proud of what we're doing in New Jersey. I'm very proud of what we've done under your direction, but I'm also very proud of our membership, the Bias Officer Association. I'm very proud of them reaching out and working with our community stakeholders, recognizing that we can't do this alone. We have to do it collectively and together. And if we do that, maybe we can just change New Jersey. Maybe we won't change the world, but maybe we can change New Jersey by recognizing, responding, and properly reporting.
Dave, I appreciate the kind words, but it is truly a collaborative effort between the association, between stakeholders, between county prosecutors, between so many other law enforcement professionals. And I think what the public should take from what you outlined in your statement just now is that we have a framework, and we have a robust framework. And we put a lot of time into building that out, and we take this seriously because we have zero tolerance for it. And while the numbers may be high in New Jersey, I think some of that is also a function of how seriously we take it, how good our reporting is, and how we follow up on every single lead, and how we look for that nexus to terrorism. And so I think through your answer, hopefully the public can see that there are so many people involved in looking at these offenses, responding to them, and making sure that we do our part in this state to eradicate hate. And that is something I'm committed to. It's personal to me. You know, I've been on the other end of it. I have lived the other end of it, and that gives me a degree of empathy, and it gives me a degree of motivation to make sure that the next kid or the next young person who's facing a difficult time, or an adult, or a vulnerable community, can live their lives freely, regardless of where they come from, what they believe, who they love. And that's a commitment that our governor shares, and it's a whole of government response that we're implementing here. And I think New Jersey has an opportunity to be a model and to get those numbers down in this state over the next number of years. So I want to thank you for the incredible partnership. I want to thank you for the incredible work that the bias crimes officers do in this state to make sure that we do stop the hate here in New Jersey. And I think because of your efforts, the efforts of the organization, we will turn those numbers down, and we will be in a better place. And there's one thing you said that particularly stood out and resonated with what Jonathan said. So we all have a responsibility to do this, whether it's not even a crime. We're not talking about investigating a crime. When we hear it at the water cooler, when we hear it in our office environment, when we hear it among friends, we now more than ever have an obligation to stand up and say something. We have to respond, and we have to react, because the consequences of not saying anything are too great. And we have to change the system if we truly want to address systemic and implicit biases. It starts with each of us acknowledging that they exist and doing our part wherever we may be, in government or in private or in education, to make sure we're doing our part to root it out. And if we all commit to that, New Jersey is going to be in a better place. So thank you, Dave, for your thoughts. And if you have a final thought to share, I want to pass it over to you, but you all are doing incredible work.
General, thank you. Listen, I think that I can tell you based on myself and every law enforcement officer I know, we took this job to run towards danger when other people run away, to protect. We took it because we like to help people. And we know that most bias incidents start off at that very level of ignorance, of name calling. And if we do nothing and we don't stand up, then it's going to escalate. And it's going to escalate to somewhere really ugly, and potentially could become criminal. So again, my final message is to reiterate what the governor said, what you stand for every day in your office, what our bias liaison stand for every day, and our membership and our community stakeholders. Please, if you see something, say something. As little as it may be to you, or you might not think that it's important to report it to law enforcement. It is extremely important to report it to law enforcement, because we know, based on training and experience, that it starts off at name calling. And if we do nothing about it, or we don't stand up and do the right thing at that point and correct it, then it's going to aggressively get worse and may potentially rise to the level of the crime of bias intimidation. So please, anybody listening, and I know that we have over 500 participants on this call, please spread the word. If you see something, say something. Notify your local law enforcement professional, call 911, contact a local law enforcement officer, and know that that law enforcement officer under the Police Training Commission and the Attorney General's Office and the Bias Crime Officer Association is trained to know how to identify it, properly report it, and they're mandated to do a report that's going to be generated to not only the state police, the Uniform Crime Reporting System, the Attorney General's Office, the Prosecutor's Office of that county, and the local jurisdiction. So in general, just again to recap, if you see something, say something. And please continue to work together with us and partner with us to make New Jersey a very safe place.
Well, thank you, Dave. And just to put a point on that final remark, you know, when I was a county prosecutor, we saw conduct among young people, which was initially dismissed as just kids being kids. And then we also saw how it escalated over a number of years to more egregious conduct. And we saw how these young people who had these ideologies and thoughts then began acting on them. And when they weren't content with just graffiti, they began to try to firebomb synagogues in Bergen County. And when they weren't able to burn down a brick synagogue, they went to find one that was made out of wood. And they tried to burn down that synagogue when a rabbi and his family slept in that synagogue. And so that is words leading to conduct. I can't help but think, what if we interceded earlier and helped these young people? And I bring it back to the quote I shared with you in the beginning. There is hope. There is hope if we identify this conduct, we intercede early, because hate is a learned behavior. And if people can learn to hate, they can be taught to love, because that comes much more easily to the human heart than its opposite, as Nelson Mandela said. So let me close with just a couple of wrap-up announcements. I want to thank all of our participants who joined us this afternoon. I want to announce that our Division on Civil Rights is creating what we call an incident response team. It's similar to the Community Relations Service of the Department of Justice. And what these teams will do is respond to civil rights incidents or where there's trauma within a community and try to address that trauma through mediation, through restorative justice, through facilitating conversations, and heal communities. And it's a model that works and has been proven at the federal level and in other states. This is going to continue to help New Jersey stand apart from the rest of the country when we address issues of bias and hate. And so if you're interested, there's information that we'll put up on where these postings are. We're hiring 5 people into 2 separate positions, 4 community relations specialists, and 1 community relations lead mediator. You can go to nj.gov/OAG/employment to get more information. Again, that's nj.gov/OAG/employment.htm to get more information. And that posting is open till July 17th. In addition to that, I want to announce that our next virtual forum will not be a Lunch and Learn series or a 2121. Our next event will be our Police Chaplains Conference, which will take place virtually on July 14th. I invite you all to participate. Our police chaplains are an integral part of law enforcement. They not only counsel law enforcement officers, but they help us heal communities in the same way that these community relations teams do or will do in our Division on Civil Rights. Gary Holden is the head of that association, a terrific partner, and we look forward to a wonderful conversation with our police chaplains. And if you're interested in becoming a chaplain, you can find more information during that virtual program on July 14th. Thank you for taking time out of your lunch for this Lunch and Learn conversation on bias, an issue that continues to plague the country and New Jersey, but an issue that we are working tirelessly to address. Thank you and stay safe.